On a November evening in 1921, a young man named Ned Doheny walked into a Washington hotel apartment carrying a small black bag. Inside it sat $100,000 in cash, stacked in 5 neat bundles of $20,000. He handed the bag to the Secretary of the Interior, a former senator named Albert Baconfall, and left. There was no receipt, no record, no witness who would speak of it for years. The men who arranged it would later call it a simple loan between old friends. A Senate committee would call it something else. It would take the better part of a decade to learn which word was true. To understand the bribe, you first have to understand the prize. In the years before the First World War, the United States Navy was converting its great fleet from coal to oil. Oil meant speed and range, and a Navy that ran on oil needed a guaranteed supply it could never be denied. So the federal government set aside vast underground fields as naval petroleum reserves, oil left in the ground as a strategic insurance policy. 2 of these reserves sat in California, at Elk Hills and Buena Vista in Kern County. A third lay in Wyoming, beneath a rock formation shaped like a teapot. That formation gave the whole affair its name. The Wyoming Reserve took its name from Teapot Rock, a weathered sandstone landmark in Natrona County that early travelers thought resembled a teapot with a spout and handle. Below it lay the oil field known as Teapot Dome. The land belonged to the government, and the oil belonged, in principle, to the Navy and the nation. For years it stayed exactly where it was, untouched, a buried treasure held in reserve. The understanding was simple. This oil was not for sale. It was for the day the country might need it most. That understanding was about to be quietly rewritten. In 1921, the country had a new president, Warren Gamaliel Harding, who had campaigned on a return to normalcy after the war. Harding filled his cabinet with friends and political allies, a circle that history would remember as much for its scandals as its policies. To run the Department of the Interior, he chose Albert Fall, a rancher and former senator from New Mexico with a long face, a wide hat, and a taste for land he could not quite afford. Fall looked the part of the rugged Westerner. Behind the image was a man whose ranch was deep in debt and whose taxes had gone unpaid for years. Fall's first move was an administrative one, and on paper it looked dull. He persuaded the Navy Secretary, Edwin Denby, to sign the naval oil reserves over to the Department of the Interior, and President Harding approved the transfer by executive order in 1921. Control of the nation's emergency oil now rested in the hands of one cabinet officer. The men who ran the Navy had given up the very fields meant to fuel their ships. Few people noticed at the time. Fewer still asked why a deeply indebted official would want such quiet authority over something so valuable. With the reserves under his control, Fall began handing them out. In 1922, without competitive bidding, he leased the Teapot Dome field in Wyoming to Harry Ford Sinclair, a self-made oil magnate whose Mammoth Oil Company was a part of the Sinclair empire. Around the same time, he leased the Elk Hills field in California to Edward Lawrence Doheny, one of the richest oilmen in the country and a personal friend of long standing. The contracts were drawn up privately, defended as a way to develop the oil and protect it from drainage by neighboring wells. To the public, they were almost invisible. What the public could not see was the money flowing the other way. Edward Doheny's cash, the $100,000 carried in the black bag by his son, reached Fall in late 1921. From Harry Sinclair came a far larger river of value, gifts and Liberty bonds, and even a herd of cattle for Fall's New Mexico ranch, sums that investigators would eventually total in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Suddenly, the indebted secretary was paying off his ranch, settling old taxes, and buying neighboring land. A man on a government salary had come into a fortune, and the timing lined up precisely with the leases. The new wealth showed first on the land Fall loved most, his ranch at 3 Rivers in the high desert of New Mexico. Neighbors watched the property transform. Fences went up, herds appeared, back taxes that had lingered for years were suddenly paid in full, and adjoining ranchland was added to the holding. To a careful observer, it raised an obvious question. Where had the money come from? A local newspaperman in Wyoming was already asking a different version of the same question about the Teapot Dome lease itself, and his complaint would set the whole machinery of investigation in motion. In April 1922, a Wyoming oil operator alerted Senator John Kendrick, who introduced a resolution calling for an explanation of the secret lease. The matter passed to a Senate committee, and a Democratic senator from Montana named Thomas Walsh took up the investigation. Walsh was methodical and quietly relentless. For more than a year, he gathered records and traced contracts, working through documents that seemed to lead nowhere. The formal hearings opened in 1923. At first, Fall's explanations held. He insisted the leases served the national interest and that his improved fortunes came from honest sources. The committee kept pulling threads. The case turned on a single discovery. Walsh established that Fall's sudden prosperity traced back to the very oilmen who had received the leases and that the $100,000 from Doheny had never been disclosed. Fall and Doheny both admitted the money had changed hands, but insisted it was a personal loan, secured by nothing more than a note and a friendship. The committee was not persuaded. A cabinet officer had grown rich exactly as he signed away public oil to the men paying him. In 1927, the Supreme Court agreed the deals were tainted and invalidated both the Elk Hills and Teapot Dome leases, returning the fields to the government. President Harding did not live to see the worst of it. He died in office in 1923, before the full scope of the scandal reached the public, and his administration's reputation collapsed in the years that followed. The investigation now moved from the Senate floor into the courtroom. Fall, Doheny, and Sinclair each faced charges. The same $100,000 sat at the center of two opposing trials. In one, prosecutors would call it a bribe paid to a public official. In the other, the defense would call it an innocent loan between friends. Remarkably, both arguments would win. In 1929, a jury found Albert Fall guilty of accepting a bribe. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison and fined $100,000, the exact sum he had taken. Fall became the first member of a presidential cabinet ever sent to prison for crimes committed in office, and he served his time in the New Mexico State Penitentiary, released early as his health failed. The verdict produced a strange contradiction that has puzzled people ever since. The man who took the money was convicted of accepting a bribe, while the trials of the men who supplied it took a very different turn. Edward Doheny, the man whose son had carried the black bag, was acquitted in 1930 of paying the very bribe Fall had been convicted of taking. A separate jury simply saw the matter differently. Harry Sinclair escaped conviction on the central charges as well, but he did not walk away clean. He had hired private detectives to shadow the jurors in his case, and for that contempt and jury tampering, he served roughly 6 months in jail. So the ledger closed unevenly. The receiver of the money went to prison. The givers, for the most part, did not. For decades, until Watergate Teapot Dome stood as the most notorious corruption scandal in American history. Its real legacy was not the prison sentences, but the rules it forced into being. The investigation hardened the principle that Congress could compel testimony and subpoena private records, including tax returns, when chasing official misconduct. It showed that a patient investigator with a paper trail could bring down a cabinet officer. The oil went back to the Navy, the teapot-shaped rock still stands in Wyoming, and the lesson endured. Public trust, once leased out in a hotel room for a bag of cash, is very hard to buy back.